The vineyard shimmered beneath the California sun, but Celine Parker carried a familiar weight as the black SUV slowed near the Whitford estate gates. She hadn't returned in years. Nothing had changed. Rows of golden vines stretched behind iron gates, and the scent of jasmine floated on the autumn breeze. At 29, Celine moved with quiet grace, her dark brown skin luminous in the October light. Her cobalt blue dress fit like armor, the gold pins in her braided hair glinting like stars. Every detail was chosen to shield her. She was a black woman entering a world that had never truly embraced her. The valet approached, his smile faltering slightly as he caught sight of her. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, voice clipped, unsure how to place her. "Good afternoon," Selena replied, offering a polite smile as she handed over her keys. The estate's sprawling grounds buzzed with wedding preparations. Linen-draped tables sparkled under fairy lights. Towering floral arrangements framed manicured pathways. Guests in pastel silks and tailored suits floated through the garden, their laughter rising like champagne bubbles. At the center of it all stood Madeline Whitford, radiant as always, preparing to marry Nathan Sinclair, a name that carried weight in California politics. Celine's adoptive sister was the golden child, flawless in every way that mattered to the Whitfords. Celine's fingers tightened on her clutch where her sketchbook rested. She'd made her mark as a celebrity makeup artist, transforming faces for magazine covers and red carpets. But among the Whitfords, her talent was dismissed as a novelty, a hobby, not a legacy. A memory flashed, 15 years old, standing at a gala in a borrowed dress. Margaret Whitford had whispered to a donor, "Celine is unique," as though her presence required explanation. Her darker skin, her creativity always outside their polished image. Releasing the memory, Celine approached the check-in table. The woman behind the clipboard greeted her with a rehearsed smile that briefly froze when Celine gave her name. "Celine Parker," she said calmly. The woman's fingers flipped quickly through the list. "Ah, yes, you're at table 27 near the catering tent." Celine's stomach tightened. Near the catering tent. The woman gestured toward the hedge-lined far corner. "Yes, just over there." Celine glanced at the seating chart. Margaret and Thomas Whitford were placed at the head table, flanked by Madeline's closest circle. Her own name sat in small gold script, isolated behind the service area. It wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. Another memory surfaced, 12 years old, gently steered to the kitchen during Madeline's birthday, told, "Let Madeline's friends bond dear." Always at the edges. Accepting the place card, Celine forced a polite smile. "Thank you." She walked toward the distant table heels, pressing into the soft earth as voices and laughter swirled around her. Margaret adjusted Madeline's veil across the lawn, glowing with pride. Thomas Whitford shook hands with donors, his voice booming with practiced charm. No one glanced her way. The table sat behind a tall hedge, half hidden from the glittering celebration. A plain white cloth covered it, surrounded by folding chairs. No centerpiece, just a single flickering candle. Celine sat with dignity, clutch resting on her lap. The clatter of dishes from the catering tent mingled with distant string music. Across the lawn, old school friends Sienna Page Laurel glanced her way briefly before resuming their conversations, their smiles distant. From a nearby table, a man loosened his tie and leaned toward her. "You're in makeup right bit unconventional compared to Madeline's law career." Selena offered a tight, professional smile. "It's my passion," she said simply. Opening her clutch, she pulled out her sketchbook. Bold colors, fierce designs, faces she had transformed. This was her truth, her proof in a world that too often looked past her. The string quartet's music swelled, signaling the ceremony's start. Guests moved toward the rose-draped trellis. Celine remained seated for a moment, her place card heavy in her hand. She could leave, slip back into her car, and drive away. But she wouldn't. She wasn't here to prove herself. She was here to witness, to stand in her truth even if no one else saw it. They still haven't changed, she whispered to herself, gripping the place card. But neither have I. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the manicured vineyards of the Whitford estate as the ceremony concluded. Guests clapped politely as Madeline and Nathan walked hand in hand back down the rose-petaled aisle, their smiles polished to perfection. The string quartet shifted seamlessly into light reception music, while servers carried trays of champagne through the buzzing crowd. Celine Parker remained at table 27, tucked behind the hedge, her view of the ceremony obstructed, but her thoughts clear. She had watched it all from a distance, as she always did, observing, never fully invited into the warmth. The reception was now in full swing, voices growing louder with each glass poured. Even from behind the tall hedges, Celine could hear the praises echoing across the garden. Madeline looked absolutely radiant, one woman gushed. The Whitfords truly know how to host, another voice chimed in, and Nathan's family must be thrilled to be joining such a respected lineage. Selene exhaled softly, steadying her breath. She reached for her clutch and opened her sketchbook again. The pages carried faces she had shaped, each design, bold, vibrant, a testament to her work, her talent, and her resilience as a Black woman in an industry that rarely offered easy paths. The vineyard's curated beauty stood in stark contrast to the quiet strength that had brought her this far. The sharp clink of heels on stone caught her attention. Three familiar figures approached, Sienna Page and Laurel, Madeline's old high school friends, who once shared whispered secrets with Celine in childhood, but had long since drifted toward Madeline's orbit. Their pastel gowns shimmered under the hanging lights, their laughter just slightly too loud. "Oh," Selene Page exclaimed with a sugary tone, her eyes darting to the simple table setup. "Did they tuck you all the way back here? I almost didn't see you." Selene offered a calm smile. "It's a lovely view of the staff in action." The comment hung awkwardly. Laurel chuckled nervously, while Sienna quickly shifted the subject. "Well, you look stunning as always. Still doing the makeup thing, right?" "It's not just a thing," Selena replied softly. "It's my career." Sienna tilted her head, lips pursed, then smiled as though indulging a hobbyist. Of course. I mean, Madeline's legal work keeps her so busy now. She's really making a name for herself." Celine's polite smile never wavered. She'd heard variations of that line for years. No matter how far she advanced in her field, it was never quite enough for this circle. Before she could respond, the trio was already distracted by a passing photographer and excused themselves with airy waves. "We'll catch up later," Paige called over her shoulder. Selene let out a quiet sigh, lowering her gaze to her sketchbook, again tracing the outlines of her latest design, a bold look inspired by the vineyard sunset. The golds and purples bled together like her own complicated history with this place. From behind the hedge came the faint sound of a sharp laugh. Curious, Selene stood and moved cautiously along the path, careful not to draw attention. As she approached the side of the gazebo, voices carried clearly in the cooling air. She recognized them instantly. "She sticks out like a sore thumb in family photos," one voice said with a cruel edge. Selena recognized Laurel's giggle. "No wonder they tucked her away," another voice added, Paige unmistakably. Then came Madeline's voice, light, sharp cutting. "Mom and Dad needed a charity case for the firm's image," she said, her words sliding out like silk. Her little makeup thing is cute, but it's not us." The others laughed a chorus of agreement that twisted like a knife. Celine pressed herself against the wooden frame of the gazebo, willing herself to stay calm. Her pulse quickened, but she refused to let the tears rise. It was never about her actions. It had always been about who she was, her skin tone, her difference. That truth burned hotter than any insult. As the voices faded into softer giggles, Selina stepped back quietly, returning to her table. The hedge concealed her retreat, but inside something hardened. She sat down, smoothing the place card on the table as though pressing out a wrinkle. A young waitress appeared moments later, her voice gentle. "Would you like something sweet? You looked like you could use this." It was Emily, a new server Selene vaguely recognized from earlier. Celine smiled genuinely this time, touched by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Emily." As Emily walked away, Celine glanced across the garden. Margaret and Thomas continued to beam at guests near the head table, oblivious or uninterested in the whispers unfolding behind the scenes. The Whitfords had always drawn neat lines of belonging. Madeline fit. Celine floated at the edges. The quartet shifted to a slower melody, signaling the first dance would begin soon. Celine closed her sketchbook gently, her fingers resting on the cover. The soft candlelight flickered against her calm but steady face. She wasn't a child anymore. She wouldn't beg for their approval or shrink to fit their narrow frame. But tonight, beneath the glowing lights and polished smiles, Celine knew the cracks were beginning to show. And somewhere deep down, a quiet resolve whispered, "This night isn't over." The string lights glowed softly as the first dance concluded, and applause rippled through the vineyard. Guests returned to their seats, the energy in the garden turning lighter, more animated with each passing minute. But for Selene Parker, the night had shifted. The cruel words whispered by Madeline and her friends still echoed sharply in her mind, pressing against old scars that had never truly healed. Celine sat quietly at table 27, her sketchbook resting in her lap, fingers gently tracing the spine. Across the garden, the Whitfords remained radiant in their curated perfection. Margaret and Thomas smiled graciously as guests approached, while Madeline and Nathan circulated hand in hand, receiving congratulatory wishes. From the outside, it looked flawless, but Celine saw what others didn't, tiny fractures behind the polished smiles. Nathan Sinclair, the groom, seemed distracted as the night wore on. His handsome face remained composed for the crowd, but Celine caught the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered away when certain guests spoke. His hand occasionally tightened around Madeline's arm, not with affection, but with something closer to restraint. Selena noticed these small details, trained to observe subtleties, both as a makeup artist and as a black woman who had spent her life reading rooms that weren't always welcoming. A soft clinking of glasses drew the crowd's attention. Julian Mercer, the creative director Celine had briefly met at previous industry events, stepped forward to offer a toast. To the beautiful couple, he said with charm, lifting his glass, "May your union be as timeless as these vines, and may your love grow as richly as this land." The crowd erupted in polite applause. Celine raised her glass along with them, though her gaze drifted again to Nathan, who offered a tight smile but said nothing. After the toast, the guests began to mill about once more. Servers moved between tables, offering hors d'oeuvres, while conversations buzzed around campaign donations, business mergers, and upcoming charity galas. Celine remained at the outskirts, her presence acknowledged only when convenient. Emily, the young server, returned to Celine's table with a small plate of fresh fruit. "You okay?" she asked softly, glancing around to make sure no one overheard. Celine offered her a warm, genuine smile. "I'm fine, thank you." Emily hesitated for a moment, lowering her voice. "I saw how some of them looked at you earlier. I just wanted to say you deserve to be here as much as anyone." For a moment, Selene felt her chest tighten, not from pain, but from gratitude. In a sea of polished indifference, the young woman's kindness was a rare balm. "That means more than you know," Selena replied gently. As Emily slipped away to attend other guests, Selene's eyes wandered across the garden again. She watched as Nathan excused himself from a group of guests and pulled out his phone, his brow furrowing as he read a message. His thumb hovered uncertainly, then scrolled through the screen with visible tension. Curiosity stirred within Selene. Something was off. She didn't know Nathan well only through brief family interactions, but tonight his body language spoke volumes. He was uneasy, and it wasn't the kind of nerves that came from wedding jitters. Madeline approached him moments later, wrapping her arm around his. She whispered something into his ear, her voice sweet but insistent. Nathan offered her a stiff smile, nodding quickly, but his shoulders remained tense. Madeline didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she chose not to. Selena shifted slightly in her seat, watching the exchange closely. Her instincts whispered that the perfect surface was hiding something deeper. Years of being treated like an accessory had taught her to see what others missed. And right now, Nathan Sinclair was a man deeply uncomfortable at his own wedding. The string quartet resumed with another soft melody. More couples filled the dance floor, but Nathan and Madeline remained at the edge, their conversation growing more animated. Selene caught snippets of hushed voices, though the distance and music drowned out the words. Margaret appeared behind them, interrupting gently with a hand on Madeline's arm. "Smile, darling. The photographers are watching." Madeline instantly brightened her expression, slipping into her well-rehearsed role. Nathan, however, simply nodded to the photographers, his eyes distant. Celine's gaze shifted again, this time to Julian Mercer, who stood a few tables away, speaking with donors. As if sensing her attention, he turned briefly and offered her a subtle nod, almost like an acknowledgement. Though they had only exchanged pleasantries in the past, Selene knew Julian was a man who understood how these circles operated. And perhaps she thought he too saw the cracks forming. The laughter and music filled the air once more, but Selene remained watchful, steady. She had entered the evening expecting nothing more than to endure familiar slights. But now a quiet tension pulsed beneath the event's surface, and as the night unfolded, she couldn't shake the growing sense that something was beginning to unravel. Her hand moved almost unconsciously over her sketchbook fingers, brushing the edge of the paper like an artist preparing for the next stroke. Whatever storm was brewing, Selene was ready to stand through it. Across the dance floor, Nathan glanced at his phone again, jaw tightening. And for the first time that evening, Selene saw it: true conflict. Whatever Nathan had just read was no minor issue. The night's illusion was beginning to strain under its own weight. As twilight deepened, the vineyard glowed under hundreds of fairy lights that flickered like distant stars. The cool Sonoma Valley air carried the soft scent of crushed grapes and earth as servers replaced empty champagne glasses with fresh ones. The party was reaching its peak, but Selene Parker felt the weight of something far heavier than celebration. She remained at table 27, her posture composed, but her eyes vigilant. Nathan Sinclair's discomfort had not lessened. In fact, it had only grown more visible with each passing hour. His jaw remained tight, his glances toward his phone more frequent, and his conversation with Madeline increasingly tense beneath their painted smiles. Selene had long trained herself to notice when appearances no longer matched reality. And tonight, the cracks in the Whitfords' perfect image were widening. Across the garden, Madeline excused herself from another group of guests and approached Nathan again. Selene couldn't hear their words, but she saw the strain in their faces, the way Madeline gripped his arm, leaning in closer with urgent whispers. Nathan's eyes darted around the garden, as though calculating his next move. His hand slid into his jacket pocket, fingers tightening around his phone. Selena's breath slowed as she studied them. She didn't know what Nathan had discovered, but it was clear it wasn't the kind of tension that faded with a few more toasts or polite reassurances. Something was coming. As servers brought out slices of towering wedding cake, guests settled back into their conversations. The hum of laughter and clinking glassware provided the perfect cover for Nathan to step away from the crowd. Selena watched as he slipped toward a quiet corner near the edge of the vineyard, just beyond the last rows of seating. Driven by instinct and the unresolved storm swirling through the evening, Selena rose from her table, careful not to draw attention. She walked casually, weaving between guests, her cobalt blue dress blending with the soft glow of the lights, as if she belonged. But her mind was sharp, calculating. Nathan stood beneath a small pergola draped in ivy, staring down at his phone, his thumb hovering as though unsure whether to press send. His expression was no longer composed. It was conflicted, burdened. Selene hesitated at a distance, but knew she couldn't retreat now. She approached slowly, giving him time to sense her presence before speaking. "Nathan," she said softly. He turned, startled but relaxed slightly upon seeing her. "Selena," he exhaled, his voice low. "I hope I'm not intruding," she offered, her tone gentle. "But you seem distracted." Nathan looked away briefly, his eyes scanning the vineyard before meeting hers again. There was no arrogance in his gaze, only weariness. "I suppose I am," he admitted. "Tonight isn't unfolding quite the way I thought it would." Selene nodded, allowing a pause to settle between them. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the pressure to keep up appearances becomes too heavy." Nathan gave a dry, almost bitter chuckle. "You have no idea how right you are." Selena's voice softened further, careful not to push. "You don't owe me an explanation, but if you need to say something out loud, I'm willing to listen." For a long moment, Nathan studied her, perhaps weighing whether he could trust the black woman who had always existed on the margins of the Whitford family's world. But maybe Selene thought it was precisely her place outside their carefully curated circle that made her safe to confide in. "I've seen things," Nathan finally said, his voice just above a whisper. "Messages, plans. This wedding, it's not what it seems." Selena's breath caught, but she stayed calm. "What kind of plans?" Nathan hesitated, then pulled up the messages on his phone, tilting the screen toward her. Words flashed across the illuminated display, texts from Madeline to friends and advisors. "Secure the marriage. Use the Sinclair name for political leverage. Connections, first love optional." Selene's stomach tightened as she read. The words were cold, calculated, a mirror of the very games she had overheard Madeline and her friends play earlier in the evening. "You're certain these are real?" she asked gently. Nathan nodded, his face lined with disappointment. "I found them weeks ago. I confronted her about it. She denied it all, said it was taken out of context, jokes between friends." He exhaled heavily. "But tonight, seeing her, seeing how carefully everything's been orchestrated, it's not a misunderstanding." Selene felt a wave of sympathy for him, layered with bitter familiarity. She knew too well what it felt like to be used as part of someone else's image. "What will you do?" she asked. Nathan's jaw flexed. "I don't know, but I can't stand up there and pretend any longer. This wedding, it's a stage, Selene." His voice cracked on the last words, and for the first time that evening, Selene saw not just a man struggling with betrayal, but a man teetering between preserving illusion or confronting truth. "You still have time to choose," Selena said gently. "Before the next toast, before the final vows, you can choose honesty." Nathan's eyes welled, but he blinked the emotion away. I didn't expect this tonight. Neither did I, Selene admitted with a quiet smile. But maybe that's why we're both standing here now. They stood together for a moment longer beneath the pergola as the music swelled again behind them. The party was pressing forward oblivious, but the weight of what Nathan carried was now out in the open. As Selena turned to walk back toward her table, Nathan remained still, his eyes fixed on the crowd, the decision before him looming larger by the second. She didn't know which choice he would make, but the current had shifted. Something irreversible was stirring. The illusion was fragile now, one breath away from collapse. The fairy lights shimmered like a false constellation over the Whitford estate as the MC's voice called for the next round of toasts. The guests gathered near the rose-draped dais, their laughter slowing into expectant murmurs. Glasses clinked. Servers refilled flutes of champagne, and the night's polished perfection hovered on the edge of something brittle. Selene Parker stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, heart steady, watching. Nathan Sinclair approached the microphone, his steps deliberate, his face carefully composed, yet pale beneath the warm glow of the lights. He adjusted the knot of his tie with a quick motion, as though trying to steady not just his appearance, but his breathing. The guests leaned forward, ready for words of love, gratitude, and promises. Margaret and Thomas Whitford beamed from their seats at the head table while Madeline clutched Nathan's arm, smiling up at him, with eyes rehearsed to perfection. Celine's fingers rested lightly on her clutch, heart quietly pounding. She had no idea what Nathan would choose, but she knew something was about to break. Thank you all for being here tonight. Nathan began, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made the air tighten. This was meant to be a celebration of trust, of love, of building a future together. The crowd nodded, some smiling, others exchanging knowing glances. But Nathan's pause stretched longer than expected, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. He swallowed hard. But trust, he continued. Voice lower, steadier, cannot survive where deception lives. A ripple passed through the audience, a subtle shift, confused glances darting from table to table. Madeline's smile froze, her fingers tightening around Nathan's wrist. "What are you doing?" she whispered sharply, barely audible beyond the front row. Nathan's expression didn't waver. "Tonight, before we move any further, I need to share the truth." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The projector, once intended for wedding photos, flickered to life behind him. The guests turned as a series of text messages appeared on the screen, magnified for all to see. The words glared under the glow of the chandeliers: secure the marriage. Use the Sinclair name for political leverage. Connections, first love, optional. Gasps broke the quiet. Whispers shot through the crowd like sparks jumping from dry kindling. Madeline's face blanched, her mouth falling open. "Nathan, stop," she hissed, her voice cracking. But Nathan pressed forward. "These are messages between Madeline and her associates, conversations about this marriage, about what it really means." He scrolled further. More texts appeared. "Play sweet for the cameras. The Sinclair name opens every door. This is the launch pad." The polished facade of the vineyard reception shattered. Guests recoiled. Some covered their mouths. Margaret's hand flew to her chest while Thomas sat frozen, jaw clenched. Donors and political allies murmured to one another in hushed voices, their eyes flicking between the screen and the head table. "It was never about love," Nathan said, his voice steady despite the growing storm. "It was about power, image, control." Madeline's breathing quickened, her carefully curated composure unraveling before everyone's eyes. "This is out of context," she cried, her voice rising. "You're twisting everything." Nathan turned to her fully now, no longer shielding the conversation. There is no twisting the truth, Madeline. You wrote these. The crowd had fallen into a stunned silence. The only sound was the projector humming as more messages scrolled, each one more damning than the last. Madeline's bridesmaids. Sienna Page and Laurel stood rooted near the champagne bar, their faces draining of color as they exchanged panicked glances. Their alliance with Madeline was now a liability, and then Madeline's fury found its target. You! She spat, her voice sharp as glass, turning toward Selene across the garden. This was you. You've always been jealous. You did this to destroy me. Every head turned toward Selene. The attention burned like stage lights. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes waiting for her reaction. But years of practice allowed her to remain steady, rooted. Selene stepped forward slowly, her voice calm and unwavering. I didn't do this, Madeline. She paused, letting her words land. You built this. The crowd collectively inhaled the simple truth, hanging heavier than any accusation. Even the MC lowered his microphone, unsure whether to intervene. Madeline's breath grew ragged, her mascara smudging as tears welled and spilled. Mom, Dad, say something, she begged, spinning toward Margaret and Thomas. But Margaret sat rigid lips, trembling, unable to form words. Thomas stared ahead, his carefully calculated empire crumbling in front of him, powerless to stop the collapse. Nathan turned to the MC. His voice was quiet, final. There will be no wedding. He placed the microphone down gently and stepped away from the dais. The crowd split instinctively, creating a pathway. As he walked into the night's shadows, his back straight, but heavy with the cost of truth. Madeline staggered, clutching her gown, the intricate lace tearing slightly, as she gasped for air. Her bridesmaids shrank further into the corners of the garden, their loyalty dissolving as quickly as the fantasy they'd all participated in. Selena stood still, her hands folded calmly before her. She did not feel victorious, only clear. The house of cards had fallen, and she had simply refused to be its scapegoat. The night had changed. The Whitford image lay in ruins, and for the first time Selene Parker's truth stood in full view, undeniable. But even as the whispers reignited around her, Selene knew the reckoning was not yet over. The vineyard's once vibrant hum had faded into an uneasy quiet. The fairy lights still flickered above the shattered celebration, casting long, fragile beams across abandoned champagne flutes and half-eaten slices of cake. What remained of the Whitford wedding now resembled more of a slow, embarrassed exodus than the grand affair it had promised to be. Selene Parker stood near the edge of the reception, watching as guests slipped quietly toward the valet stand, murmuring polite goodbyes wrapped in thinly veiled relief. The smiles had dimmed. The whispers had grown bolder. The Whitford name, once spoken with effortless reverence, now hovered in the air like a question mark. Across the garden, Margaret moved stiffly among remaining guests, her voice high and brittle as she offered forced reassurances. Just a terrible misunderstanding. Family matters, you know. But few lingered long enough to listen. Thomas trailed behind her, his face hollowed, as though the weight of their unraveling legacy pressed heavier than any public shame. Madeline had vanished entirely, her sobs having carried into the vineyard's darker rows earlier. Selene hadn't followed. There was nothing left to say. Selene exhaled, her chest steady. The tension that once knotted her spine had loosened. She wasn't triumphant, only clear. The false structures that had kept her in the shadows for years had collapsed under their own weight, and all she had done was refuse to shoulder the blame one more time. As the last of the guests disappeared, Emily, the young server who had offered kindness earlier, approached quietly. She carried a folded napkin in one hand, her kind eyes scanning the near-empty garden. You held your head high tonight, Emily said softly. Celine offered her a warm, grateful smile. Thank you, Emily. The young woman hesitated, then added, I hope you know. You didn't just survive this. You changed it. Celine's throat tightened unexpectedly at the simple truth in those words. She nodded, blinking gently. That means more than you realize. Emily gave a small, respectful nod and slipped back toward the catering tent, leaving Celine alone with the vineyard's soft rustle. Celine glanced down at her clutch resting against her hip. Inside, David Caldwell's business card lay tucked next to her ever-present sketchbook, a quiet reminder of where her true story lived. Her designs, her work, her art, built not for acceptance from the Whitfords, but for herself. Her phone buzzed softly, Margaret's name flashing on the screen again. Celine silenced it without hesitation, as she had done earlier in the night. Moments later, Thomas's name followed. She ignored that call too. Their voices belonged to a world she had finally stepped beyond. The valet pulled her car to the curb as she approached. Her modest sedan stood out among the black-tie fleet of town cars, but Celine no longer cared about appearances. She climbed in, closing the door with a calm finality. The vineyard faded in her rearview mirror as she pulled away its grand arches, shrinking against the starry California sky. As she drove into the still night, the coastal breeze grew cooler, and the horizon widened with every mile. The calls from Margaret and Thomas ceased. The silence was not empty, it was full. Full of the space she had finally reclaimed. Eventually, the vineyard's artificial glow disappeared altogether, replaced by the vast, open darkness of the California hills. Celine pulled off at a familiar lookout spot by the cliffs, where the Pacific roared in its eternal rhythm below. She stepped out the wind, catching her braids, the salt air filling her lungs. The sea didn't care about family names or image. It simply existed, wild and honest, just as she intended to live. She pulled her sketchbook from her clutch, flipping gently through pages filled with vibrant, unapologetic designs, colors as bold as the woman who had created them. And then, on a blank page under the moon's soft glow, she began to draw. This time the strokes came easier, freer. No more sketches seeking approval, only expressions of her truth. As dawn's first hint of pink crept along the horizon, Celine Parker smiled, not for anyone watching, but for herself. For the first time, she was exactly where she needed to be. As Celine Parker stood quietly by the cliffs, the Pacific's steady rhythm whispered beneath the early light, carrying away the echoes of a night long overdue for truth. The vineyard, once full of polite smiles and careful appearances, had crumbled under its own weight, leaving behind only what was real and what had never truly belonged to her. And yet Celine did not walk away carrying bitterness. She carried something far stronger, the calm certainty of a woman who no longer needed permission to exist fully in her own light. Her journey reminds us that breaking free from judgment isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is simply standing firm, quietly refusing to shrink even when the world draws its circles too tight. Celine had faced the whispers, the dismissals, the condescension wrapped in politeness, and met them with her talent, her dignity, and the quiet courage of not giving up. In a world quick to define worth by family names, appearances, or skin tone, she showed that true belonging is not something granted. It is claimed through the strength of one's own hands and heart. Like the lighthouse standing alone against the crashing waves, one steady light can guide us through even the darkest fogs of judgment. And perhaps in our own lives, there are those nearby friends, neighbors, even strangers silently carrying weights we do not see. A gentle word, an open heart, or a refusal to join the easy chorus of assumptions might be the light they need to steady their own course. If Celine's story touched a quiet place in your heart, consider sharing that kindness forward. In doing so, we help draw wider circles where everyone's light can be seen and none are left standing in the shadows.